World Book Night was started 3 years ago because there was a real sense from a group of people, writers, publishers, and people like yourselves who love books, that in the days that we're in now of so much virtual relationships, isn't it marvellous to be able to go to somebody with something you treasure, a book that you've understood, that you've come to care about, and pass it on to somebody and say, I personally would like you to read this. That idea of a gift of a book, which is really a gift of a story, might open up for that person a totally new door into a world that they haven't been into before, because that's what art does. It's a window into other people's experiences, and it's also a window back to us. The book comes in lots of forms now, of course. It's not all, a physical thing that you can hand. But most of us still value that moment when you're handed a present, and when it's the book and you leaf through it, and you start thinking about the writing, the narrative, who wrote it, what their history was, when was it written, etc. It opens up so many ideas about the miracle of human creativity. And at the bottom of that is probably the need to tell stories. There's an extraordinary film, I don't know whether you've seen it, by Werner Herzog, looking at it's called Cave of Dreams. Try to see it if you can. It opens up the caves in France thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, where Cro-Magnon men and women, I'm sure, painted animals onto the walls of the cave. And they're not factual representation of the things that need hunting. They're graceful, beautiful, and they're stories of these marvellous animals. And you can see the most basic need that humans have is to tell each other about the world that they live in. So handing out these books is a way of valuing story and valuing the book itself. This year, we've handed out 500,000 books, and 20,000 people in the UK and Ireland have been the givers. Some of you are here. And at the same time, in the United States, 25,000 people, in fact, this very minute, because of the time difference, are handing out books. And that's in food banks, it's in libraries, it's in schools, it's in, I think we've got the Homeless Crisis Book Club here tonight. Yes, yes, yes. Wherever people are, we're trying to get the idea of the book being something that matters. I just want to link that a little bit to the history of the Southbank Centre. For those of you who don't know, it was created in 1951. It was the festival of Britain after a horrendous war, a barbaric war, and one of the salvations was the idea that you could build a better future if you had people bringing their imagination together. In fact, the phrase was the propaganda of the imagination. That was the phrase behind the Festival of Britain. And the Southbank Centre is dedicated to that idea, the propaganda of the imagination, and the fact that the imagination is for everybody, is about everybody. And actually what we all need to do to understand each other and to keep peace is to hear more of the hidden stories about lives that we don't understand and we don't know. And that is the great way of connecting. So thank you tonight to all the donors, thank you to the trusts, and thank you to all the givers. Thank you to the publishers who've foregone any profits they would have made had you bought any of these books. And of course, thank you to the writers, A, for that fiscal gift, but most importantly, for the gift of the imagination which they've given us all. I have to tell you what my favourite book is. It's really impossible to tell you. One of my favourite books is Bob Along the Brownie Man, from when I was 6, which taught me a huge amount about elves. But then the next favourite after that, I think, that really started something new in me when I was about 16, was reading Doris Lessing, Martha Quest, and thinking, actually, there's a story that girls and women have that is probably a little naughty to have to tell, but it has to be told. A subversive reality about the way that girls and women really think when they're not so well behaved. And I've tried to live my life by that syndrome of not being too well behaved ever since. However, I probably can't be as subversive as the host tonight, who is Hardeep Singh Kohli. He's a writer, he's a comedian, he's a broadcaster, he's a deeply serious man, but on top of all of that, he has a furnace of humour, which is fantastic. to be with. He writes for The Right Show, he's a reporter on The One Show, Question Time, and This Week. He also has written The Beginner's Guide to Ron Hubbard, which is a must. In his journalist capacity in Scotland on Sunday, he has a column called Hardeep is Your Love. He's certainly become mine. So, ladies and gentlemen, your host, Hardeep.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Another one to tick off the list, being introduced by the amazing Jude Kelly. I can't tell you, backstage, it's like a who's who of who's who. And similarly, in front of us here. Because actually, more important than the writers, more important than the publishers, more important than anyone are the givers, the receivers, and the readers. So give yourselves a round of applause for simply existing. I've been very lucky to be associated with World Book Night for all of its 3 years. And it's quite astonishing to think about 500,000 books being exchanged, particularly when one thinks about it in prisons and in care homes. And as you'd mentioned, amongst the homeless, I remember at Edinburgh a couple of years ago, on the way to and from my gig, I used to walk by a homeless guy and I'd occasionally buy him a sandwich or a coffee. And one time, he asked me to buy him a book. So I know Ian Rankin, so I got him a signed copy of an Ian Rankin, and it's the biggest smile he ever gave me. Rather than food or drink, he wanted a brilliantly crafted Scottish thriller. So perhaps that says something about the power of reading. I just thought it was worth mentioning. Yodel are supporting tonight by delivering 500,000 books. That's 225,000 parcels from 57 service centres, 3,920 addresses, and a great deal of love. The BBC, of course, are here tonight, World Book Night's partner for a third year in a row. There's events all over the country, in the Highlands, the Islands, a special night in Liverpool, in other words, festival, and even Cambridge has a literary event going on tonight. So well done, because often places like Cambridge get overlooked. That'll be the furnace Jude was referring to. I just need to do a very brief bit of housekeeping. Can I ask you all to keep your mobile phones on? My uncle's on his way from Wolverhampton. My battery's died, and I've given him all your number. I think we know what I'm saying there, subtextually. If your phone does ring through the night, you'll be expected to make a 4-figure donation to your local library. It's been a tough time for books. No one can pretend that a tough time for reading, but I'm so happy to be associated with a generation that I hope will be remembered for the exchanging of books rather than the closing of libraries. A generation that will be remembered for the sharing of passion rather than the diminishing of Arts Council funding. That's the end of the politics. I remember my girlfriend applied for a job recently to work in a theatre and also got offered a job to work online. And a 20-something friend of hers said, "The theatre's old hat. You want to go for online?" And I thought to myself, so storytelling is old-fashioned, is it? Storytelling is dead. There could be no better way tonight, I think, to start our readings than with storytelling that reimagines the most ancient form of storytelling. Memorial is a reimagining of a classic poem by a poet, Alice Oswald. It looks at Homer's Iliad in a new way. And this is what Alice says about her own poem. And if this is how she describes her own writing, imagine how beautiful her poetry is. You won't have to imagine for too long. The Iliad is a vocative poem, perhaps even it is invocative, as if speaking directly to the dead in the aftermath of the Trojan War, an attempt to remember people's names and lives without the use of writing, a series of memories and similes laid side by side. I can't think of any other event that would start with poetry. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the poet, Alice Oswald.
And Hector died, like everyone else. He was in charge of the Trojans, but a spear found out the little patch of white between his collarbone and his throat, just exactly where a man's soul sits, waiting for the mouth to open. He always knew it would happen. He who was so boastful and anxious and used to nip home, deafened by weapons, to stand in full armour in the doorway, like a man rushing in leaving his motorbike running. All women loved him. His wife was Andromache. One day he looked at her quietly. He said, "I know what will happen." And an image stared at him of himself dead and her in Argos weaving for some foreign woman. He blinked and went back to his work. Hector loved Andromache, but in the end, he let her face slide from his mind. He came back to her sightless, strengthless, expressionless, asking only to be washed and burned, and his bones wrapped in soft cloths, and returned to the ground. Like leaves. Who could write a history of leaves? The wind blows their ghosts to the ground, and the spring breathes new leaf into the woods. Thousands of names, thousands of leaves. When you remember them, remember this. Dead bodies are their lineage, which matter no more than the leaves. Like chaff, flying everywhere at threshing time. The winnowers waft their fans, and the wind does its work, and a goddess is there, picking the grain from its husk, while a fine white dust covers everything. Like thousands of water birds, mill and mass in the air. Great gatherings of geese and cranes and long-necked swans, flaring and settling in those fields where the rain runs down to the caster, continually shuffling and lifting and loving the sound of their wings. They shriek as they land, like a huge bird fair, a valley full of voices. Like wandering tribes of flies that gather in sheds in shadowy spring when the milk splashes in the buckets. Like crickets, leaning on their elbows in the hedges, tiny, dried-up men speaking pure light. Like when God throws a star and everyone looks up to see that whip of sparks, and then it's gone. Like when God throws a star and everyone looks up to see that whip of sparks, and then it's gone. Thank you.
Crickets with elbows. What a beautiful image. I had to study Iliad at school. If only we'd have had her around, it would have been so much less tedious. From ancient Greece to contemporary Greece, our next writer, her celebrated first novel, The Island, found the intimate in the epic and the epic in the intimate, writing about a family torn apart by tragedy, war and passion. And on top of it, she's a fantastically nice woman. Please put your hands together for the lovely Victoria Hislop.
Thank you. I'm going to read 3 short extracts from The Island. The first of them is where Maria, the main character of the novel, discovers a mark on her foot. The second is when she has this mark formally diagnosed, and the third is when she departs for the island of exile, where she expects to spend the rest of her life. Maria kicked off her shoes to climb onto a rickety chair so that she could reach into the back of a cupboard. And as she stepped up, she noticed a strange mark on her foot. Her heart missed a beat. In some lights, it might scarcely have been visible. It was like a shadow, but in reverse, a patch of dry skin that was slightly paler than the rest. It almost looked as though she had burned her foot in the sun and the skin had peeled off to leave the lighter pigment underneath. Perhaps it was nothing at all to worry about, but she felt sick with anxiety. She usually bathed at night, and in the dim light such a thing could have gone unnoticed for months. And that night was the most troubled Maria had ever endured. The hours of darkness passed with aching slowness as she tossed and turned and fretted with fear. When she finally fell into a brief and fitful sleep, she dreamt of her mother and of huge stormy seas which wrecked Spinalonga as though it was a great ship. It was a relief when day broke. Eventually, the doctor arrived, profusely apologetic that he had made them wait, and ushered them straight into his office. Maria's file was on his desk, and he opened it and shut it again, as though there was something he needed to check. There was not, of course. He knew exactly what he had to say, and there was no reason to keep these people waiting any longer. He came straight to the point. Miss Petrikis, I am afraid that there are bacteria in your skin lesions to indicate that leprosy is present in your body. He was not sure for whom the news was more devastating, the daughter or the father. The girl was the spitting image of her late mother, and he was keenly aware of this cruel repetition of history. He hated these moments. Of course, there were emollient phrases that he could use to soften the blow, such as, "It's not too advanced, we might be able to help you," or "I think we've caught it early." The announcement of bad news, however it was delivered, was still just that. Bad news, catastrophic and cruel. The pair sat in silence, their worst fears realised. In their minds, they both pictured Spinalonga, knowing for certain now that this was to be Maria's destination, her destiny. A cold wind whipped through the narrow streets of Plaka, and the chill of the autumnal air encircled Maria, paralysing her body and mind with a numbness that almost blocked her senses, but did nothing to alleviate her grief. As she stumbled the last few metres to the jetty, she leaned heavily on her father, her gait that of an old crone for whom every step brought a stab of pain. But this pain was not physical. Her body was as strong as any young woman who had spent her life breathing the pure Cretan air. And her skin was as youthful and her eyes as intensely brown and bright as of any girl on this island. The little boat, unstable with its cargo of oddly shaped bundles lashed together with string, bobbed and lurched on the sea. Georgis lowered himself in slowly and, with one hand trying to hold the craft steady, reached out with the other to help his daughter. Once she was safely on board, he wrapped her protectively in a blanket to shield her from the elements. The only visible indication then that she was not simply another piece of cargo were the long strands of dark hair that flew and danced freely in the wind. He carefully released his vessel from its mooring. There was nothing more to be said or done, and their journey began. This was not the start of a short trip to deliver supplies. It was the beginning of Maria's one-way journey to start a new life. Life on Spinalonga. Thank you.
The power of words, passion and punctuation. I was just thinking, the only people that seem to ever say you can't write about X, Y or Z are your agent or your publisher halfway through a 3-book deal. It seems that as readers, we are discriminating yet indiscriminate in what we will choose to read about. I mean, who would have thought a book about a fox stealing from farmers would have been so prominent in my development and taught me so much about left of centre politics, as the fantastic Mr. Fox clearly did. And our next writer and reader shows that really there's no limit to what you can write about. Her 8th novel is 40 Rules of Love, which clearly explains where I've been going wrong, because I only thought there were 4. She's a political scientist, and she writes in both English and Turkish. This book, 40 Rules of Love, is about Rumi, the mystic, poet, and philosopher. gives me great pleasure to introduce Elif Shafak, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here to celebrate books and stories. I'm going to read a very, very short excerpt from the 40 Rules of Love. This is the voice of Rumi, the great poet, mystic, and visionary. And the year is 1245, and he talks about love. Bountiful is your life, full and complete. Or so you think, until someone comes along and makes you realize what you've been missing all this time. Like a mirror that reflects what is absent rather than present, he shows you the void in your soul, the void you have resisted seeing. That person can be a lover, a friend, or a spiritual master. Sometimes it can be a child to look after. What matters is to find the soul that will complete yours. All the prophets have given the same advice. Find the one who shall be your mirror. For me, that mirror is Shams of Tabriz. Until he came and forced me to look deep into the crannies of my soul, I had not faced the fundamental truth about myself, that though successful and prosperous outside, I was lonely and unfulfilled inside. When you love someone this much, you expect everyone around you to feel the same way, sharing your joy and euphoria. And when that doesn't happen, you feel surprised, then offended, and betrayed. How could I possibly make my family and friends see what I see? How could I describe the indescribable? Shams is my sea of mercy and grace. He is my fountain of life and my tall cypress tree, majestic and evergreen. His companionship is like the fourth reading of the Quran, a journey that can only be experienced from within, but never grasped from outside. Unfortunately, most people make their evaluations based on images and gossip. To them, Shams is an eccentric dervish. They think he behaves strangely and speaks blasphemy, that he is utterly unpredictable and unreliable. To me, however, he is the epitome of love that moves the whole universe, at times retreating into the background and holding every piece together, at times exploding in bursts. An encounter of this kind happens once in a lifetime, once in 38 years. Ever since Shams came into our lives, people have been asking me what it is in him that I find so special, but there's no way I can answer them. At the end of the day, those who ask this question are the ones who won't understand it. And as for those who do understand, they don't ask such things. The quandary I find myself in reminds me of the story of Layla and Harun al-Rashid, the famous Abbasid emperor. Upon hearing that a Bedouin poet named Qais had fallen hopelessly in love with Layla and lost his mind for her and was therefore named Majnun, the madman, the emperor became very curious about the woman who had caused such misery. This Layla must be a very special creature, he thought, a woman far superior to all other women. Perhaps she's an enchantress, unequaled in beauty and charm. Excited, intrigued, he played every trick in the book to find a way to see Layla with his own eyes. Finally, one day, they brought Layla to the emperor's palace. When she took off her veil, Harun al-Rashid was disillusioned. Not that Layla was ugly or old, but she wasn't extraordinarily attractive either. She was a human being with ordinary human needs and several flaws, a simple woman like countless others. The emperor did not hide his disappointment. Are you the one Majnun has been crazy about? Why? You look so ordinary. What is so special about you? Layla broke into a smile. Yes, I am Layla, she said. But you see, you are not Majnun. You have to see me with the eyes of Majnun. Otherwise, you could never solve this mystery called love. How can I explain the same mystery to my family, friends, or students? How can I make them understand that for them to grasp what is so special about Shams of Tabriz, they have to start looking at him with the eyes of Majnun? Thank you.
Beautiful. Like a mirror that reflects what is absent rather than what is present. I think we all wish for one of them. I alluded to Roald Dahl moments ago, and the power and the potency of what you read in your earlier years can really shape your reading life ahead. Not only rereading those books, but certain of those books are then extrapolated further. And our next reader, reading from Silver, which is his follow-on, his sequel to Treasure Island. If you feel like giving me a lifetime of devotion, I give you Sir Andrew Motion. Sorry, I'm personally very fond of him.
He thinks poetry is still written in rhyme. We don't know when Treasure Island is set. Robert Louis Stevenson says 17 blank blank is the date, but the Stevenson scholars reckon it's in the early 1760s. So it's a pre-Enlightenment story. In Silver, it's 1801, and it's the children that go back to the island. Jim Hawkins, the son of Jim Hawkins, and Natty Silver, who's the daughter of Mr. Silver and his wife, who's mentioned but never met in Treasure Island, a woman of colour. She's described as being, so presumably somebody he met, Mr. Silver met in the Caribbean on some previous trip. In order to launch the expedition to get the silver that Stevenson tells us on the first page of Treasure Island is still on the island, Mr. Silver commissions a boat. He's not going himself, but he commissions a boat. And in order to launch it on its expedition, Jim, my Jim, has to betray his father, the original Jim, by stealing the map from his father. And he does that, and off they go. And as they sail down the Thames, they pass the inn in which my Jim was raised by his father, which of course is called a Hispaniola. Captain Beamish now ordered the crew to set us on our way. They did this immediately, with some men untying the Nightingale fore and aft, then pushing us away from the quay with long poles, and others working the capstan to raise our anchor, chanting as they did so. Haul away, you sons of Neptune, haul away. Say goodbye to all your lassies, haul away. For we're leaving dear old England, and we're bound across the waves. Haul away, you sons of Neptune, haul away. They sang this 3 or 4 times, and when the work was done, we were already a yard from the dockside. The crew fore and aft now laid their poles on deck and began setting the sails, which took the breeze with a delightful, clean, smacking sound. So I felt the Nightingale quicken like a living creature. Have a care, shouted the captain, as the booms of both masts swung across deck. But the hands knew how to dodge, and in a trice everything was under control again, and we were making our way towards the river. As we found our place among the traffic heading downstream, I noticed the water made a beautiful, low, humming sound. This was our prow talking, as sailors say, treading the innumerable ripples with an incessant, weltering splash. The waterfront of London quickly vanished, docks and warehouses turning into open country, and a panorama of fields and cattle, until we reached the fancy houses of Greenwich and the little mole of the observatory. I'd seen these things only recently, rowing to and fro with Natty, but from the greater height of the Nightingale, and with a stronger feeling of purpose that now possessed me, they had an extra freshness and significance. Everything told me that I was leaving my boyhood, that I was choosing the terms of my own existence. These feelings, I dare say, were all the more intense because Natty stood beside me. At any rate, I gave this as the reason why tears swelled into my eyes as we entered a bend of the river that I recognized as the beginning of my home stretch. It was a remarkable moment, even though it came so early in our voyage. With the blackened old timbers of the Hispaniola and the low red sweep of its tiled roof appearing on the horizon, as if I were returning to it as a ghost. It put me in mind of a sentence I remembered my father using in his stories, which he heard used of the pirate O'Brien, whom he called a rank Irelander. Do you take it as a dead man is dead for good, or do he come again? I saw in minute detail the dozens of winding tracks I had walked since childhood, and remembered in a single instant the hundreds of lives I had seen there, the moorhens and geese, the summer visitors, and the foxes that preyed on them. It was an immense variety, but all squeezed into something like a keyhole, and set my heart racing, because I knew it was passing away from me, even while it came close. Exactly when we reached the inn, as if it had been ordained by fate, the front door opened, and my father appeared. He was wearing the old blue sailor's cap he had kept as a memento of earlier days, and carried in his right hand a pail of water. My first instinct was to duck below the bulwarks out of sight, but I thought this might draw his attention, so I stood still, without making a sound, and watched him. He walked towards the bed of roses that formed the border of our property, where it met the towpath, and poured his pail of water over the flowers, very studiously, making sure not to miss one. I saw the earth darken. Then he straightened, his free hand smoothing the small of his back, and glanced around him. Although he looked directly at the nightingale and seemed to admire her, he did not change his expression, which to my eyes had a sad severity. Then he turned away with a shrug, and after that, I saw him no more.
I think the beauty of literature, one of the many beauties, is that it allows you to see the world through other eyes. I remember reading Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale in just one more chapter. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I thought, just finish it now. And I think the many things Atwood taught me about writing is one particularly salient issue is that men, if they work hard, can achieve great writing like women too. So it's best that men don't give up. Talking about seeing the world through different eyes, our next reader, I can't personally think of another contemporary writer that's affected and changed as many people's lives as Mark Haddon. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night was not only the most applied for book in the first World Book Night, not only was it made into a National Theatre production, not only was it the winner of the Whitbread and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, I feel, anecdotally at any rate, from what I'm told, that it was a lot of people's return to reading in their adult life. Such was the power of the writing. And again, he has been a great supporter of World Book Night and generally a great supporter of reading. Prepare yourselves for 4 minutes of Mark Haddon magic. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Haddon.
I pulled the fork out of the dog and lifted him into my arms and hugged him. He was leaking blood from the fork holes. I like dogs. You always know what a dog is thinking. It has 4 moods: happy, sad, cross, and concentrating. Also, dogs are faithful and they do not tell lies because they cannot talk. I had been hugging the dog for 4 minutes when I heard screaming. I looked up and saw Mrs. Shears running towards me from the patio. She was wearing pajamas and a housecoat. Her toenails were painted bright pink and she had no shoes on. She was shouting, "What in fuck's name have you done to my dog?" I do not like people shouting at me. It makes me scared that they are going to hit me or touch me, and I do not know what is going to happen. "Let go of the dog," she shouted. "Let go of the fucking dog, for Christ's sake." I put the dog down on the lawn and moved back 2 meters. She bent down. I thought she was going to pick the dog up herself, but she didn't. Perhaps she noticed how much blood there was and didn't want to get dirty. Instead, she started screaming again. I put my hands over my ears and closed my eyes and rolled forward till I was hunched up with my forehead pressed onto the grass. The grass was wet and cold. It was nice. This is a murder mystery novel. Siobhan said that I should write something I would want to read myself. Mostly, I read books about science and maths. I do not like proper novels. In proper novels, people say things like, I am veined with iron, with silver, and with streaks of common mud. I cannot contract into the firm fist which those clench who do not depend on stimulus. I found this in a book in the library in town when Mother took me into town once. What does it mean? I do not know, nor does Father, nor do Siobhan or Mr. Jevons. I have asked them. Siobhan has long blonde hair and wears glasses which are made of green plastic. And Mr. Jevons smells of soap and wears brown shoes that have approximately 60 tiny circular holes in each of them. But I do like murder mystery novels, so I am writing a murder mystery novel. In a murder mystery novel, someone has to work out who the murderer is and then catch them. It is a puzzle. If it is a good puzzle, you can sometimes work out the answer before the end of the book. Siobhan said that the book should begin with something to grab people's attention. That is why I started with the dog. I also started with the dog because it happened to me, and I find it hard to imagine things which did not happen to me. Siobhan read the first page and said that it was different. She put this word into inverted commas by making the wiggly quotation sign with her first and second fingers. She said that it was usually people who are killed in murder mystery novels. I said that 2 dogs were killed in The Hound of the Baskervilles, the hound itself and James Mortimer's spaniel. But Siobhan said they weren't the victims of the murder. Sir Giles Baskerville was. She said that this was because readers cared more about people than dogs, so if a person was killed in the book, readers would want to carry on reading. I said that I wanted to write about something real, and I knew people who had died, but I did not know any people who had been killed, except Edward's father from school, Mr. Paulson, and that was a gliding accident, not murder, and I didn't really know him. I also said that I cared about dogs because they were faithful and honest, and some dogs were cleverer and more interesting than some people. Steve, for example, who comes to school on a Thursdays, needs help to eat his food and could not even fetch a stick. Siobhan asked me not to say this to Steve's mother. Thank you.
It's funny, I've never heard Mark read from Dog before, and I'm sitting there. It's his book, he's written it, he's reading it, and still there's a twinge in me that's going, no, that's not how they sound. That's the power of literature, isn't it nuts? Thank you, Mark. I heart him. I heart the next reader too. It's interesting, I've known Rose Tremain for a few years, and she's a dear friend. And I remember when I first came across the road home, I remember thinking how prescient, as the child of an immigrant, to read a book about contemporary immigration, about Lev, and about Eastern Europe, and about the trials and tribulations of modern life in London. It is astonishing that Rose managed to predict so much in that book. She's also asked me personally to point out the shoes she's wearing tonight, because she's gone to great trouble to put on a fabulous pair of shoes, and I think you'll agree, much as she succeeded with writing, she's particularly succeeded with shoes. Ladies and gentlemen, the ever-lovely Rose Tremain.
Not true, not true. Don't believe a word he says. This is a book about displacement, exile. It concerns an immigrant from Eastern Europe who comes to London. It's also a book about loss. He comes because he's lost almost everything. His wife has died. He worked in a sawmill, and the sawmill has run out of trees, so he's lost his job. And he leaves behind a slightly vexatious mother and a little daughter called Maya, who he adores. And he gets on a bus, and this bus trundles all the way across Europe. and his destination is London. I'm going to read two very short little pieces, one where he's on the bus, and then one a little bit later on in the book. On the bus, he meets a fellow countrywoman called Lydia, who is going to feel less exiled, less displaced than him, because she has quite a good grasp of English, whereas Lev has only a few words. So this is a little conversation that happens between Lev and Lydia. You have to imagine Lydia, she's eating hard-boiled eggs. She's very well prepared for this journey. Lev isn't well prepared at all. He's got nothing. She's got a lot of eggs. There was a silence while Lydia ate her hard-boiled egg. She chewed very quietly. When she'd finished the egg, Lev said, "My English isn't too bad. I took some classes in Bahrain, but my teacher told me my pronunciation wasn't very good. May I say some words and you can tell me if I'm pronouncing them correctly?" "Yes, of course," said Lydia. So Lev said, "Lovely. I am legal. May you help me?" "May I help you?" corrected Lydia. "Oh, may I help you?" repeated Lev. "Go on," said Lydia. "Stalk," said Lev. "I am lost. B&B. B&B, said Lydia. No, you mean to be or not to be." "No," said Lev. B&B, family hotel, quite cheap. Lydia has certain designs on Lev of all kinds, and one of them is to educate him and to help him with his English. So she gives him, over a rather agonizing lunch, from which she hopes something more will come than does come of it, a copy of Hamlet. Lev's English is quite good by this time, but Hamlet is sort of way beyond him. But in every sense, this man is a very, very hard worker. And so he struggles on through all these pages. He's struggling on with Hamlet until we get to here, when he's left London. He's temporarily working in East Anglia, where I live, on an asparagus farm and living in a caravan which he shares with two Japanese workers called Ming. And all this time he's been struggling on with Hamlet. He's very alone at this moment in his journey. His life is reduced to a kind of just sort of eat, sleep, work, survival. To be or not to be. Lev reached these famous lines on a night of sudden rain, with the new mattress cover soft under his body and the Ming sighing and whimpering in their complicated sleep. He remembered with a smile how on the bus Lydia had confused the words with the term B&B. He read on. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. Lev lay back and let the book rest beside him. Even he, with his still flawed understanding of English, could admire the economy with which the question was expressed. And he wrestled with the thought that if only language could always be as simple, as sweet, as unambiguous as this, then life itself would somehow be less complicated. To be or not to be. He said it over and over, tried to translate it into his language, fell asleep saying it, remembered in his dreams how when his wife Marina had died, he'd wanted not to be. But he woke the following morning with the early sun and no will to die. Though he was in a sea of troubles, he'd find the means to take arms against them. Somehow, he would. Thank you.
Next time I have a fried breakfast in a one-star Shropshire hotel, I'll think of Shakespeare. The Power of Writing, that's The Road Home, a World Book Night title. It's interesting. Rose was reading from her original copy of the book. There are obviously special editions for World Book Night, but seeing her copy, it reminded me, through my life, I don't know about you, but, well, I'm imagining many of you haven't given turbans away, or given ties away, or CDs or sofas away. And I sometimes forget who I've given turbans, ties, CDs and sofas to, but I'll never forget who I've given books to, or who've given me those books. And Luke Healy, Rose's daughter's friend, gave me The Road Home. It's funny what you don't forget, isn't it? Talking of what you don't forget, thankfully historical novels allow us to remember, albeit a reimagined past. And as someone that had a Jesuit education, I've been particularly interested in hearing the next reading from Blood and Beauty, which is about the Borgias, a fascinating family. The only sort of family that make a Sikh family around marriage time seem dull. Less poisoning, but a lot more dancing in the Sikh families. Reading from her novel, please welcome Sarah Dunant.
I'll speak to you later about what's fact and what's fiction. It is a historical fact that when Rodrigo Borgia took over the papacy in 1492 to become Alexander VI, he had a 17-year-old mistress. It is also a historical fact that she was known for having very remarkable hair. What follows, though, is an act of the imagination. The first time Rodrigo Borgia had taken the young Giulia Farnese to his bed, she had stood nervously in front of him, clothed only in her hair, her breasts peeking out from the sweeping golden curtain. How could a man resist? The Pope's mistress's hair, such a rich topic for gossip. And why not? When holy men lived on the top of columns to worship the Lord, the length of their hair was proof of their devotion. For Mary Magdalene, it was the cloak that covered her shame and the cloth she used to dry the tears that washed our Saviour's feet. For Giulia Farnese, though, it has always been the key to glory. At her birth, the midwives had been astonished when, cleaning the blood slime from her head, a set of damp, dark curls had sprung forth. By the age of 1, they had ripened into a yellow harvest, snaking around her ears. By 3, the locks were on her shoulders. By 7, halfway down her back. When had they realized it was to be her fortune? Certainly the household was enthralled to its demands early. The washing, the lightening, the oiling, the rinsing, the drying, and the brushing, the endless, endless brushing. While her brothers learned Latin and practiced jousting, she sat immobile, her neck muscles braced against the force of the brush, unable to read, unable to sew, unable to do anything but study the weave of the dress in her lap. By the time she started to bleed, her hair, this seventh veil, this river in spate, this golden shroud, was down to her knees, and the news of it and her beauty was no longer confined to the house. You are not to be alarmed. The first time it had been brute winter, and he had warmed his hands before so that his touch would not shock. I will know nothing to hurt you. Later, he had arranged her locks across the pillows like a giant sunburst pulsing out from her head, and later still, he had coaxed her into riding on top of him and letting it fall and sweep over his chest and face. In all of this, he was a courteous and fulsome lover, delighting so much in his own delight that it had been impossible to be frightened of him. Yet she had been afraid. Not just of her power, because by now she had some understanding of that, but because this silky wonder that she carried with her would only stay perfect when left alone. Once the sweat and suck of skins took over, it began to snag and tangle. Then there were moments when he would roll onto it and her head would be caught by his weight. Of course, she could not cry out, for it was her and she was it, and together they were his mermaid and his Venus and his very own Mary. After the first few encounters, the daytime house rang out with the sounds of her yelps. By now, the matting and tangling had set fast, and however gently the house slave pulled, however wide the tooth comb was used, Julia could not stop herself from crying, so that after a while, neither she nor they were sure if it was her hair or her life that she was weeping over, for so much had changed in so short a time. In the end, she had had to tell him. He had been surprisingly understanding. Her desire to please was touching, and truth be told, he too had been finding it somewhat tiresome negotiating this third lover in the bed. Together they agreed to its imprisonment. From then on, when they made love, it was held inside a heavy rope plait. Now, as he entered her, he scooped it up and looped it once, then twice around her neck like a heavy gold necklace or a noose. And she, because she was a fast learner, threw back her head and groaned as if he was indeed strangling her, and the experience was exciting as it was fearful. 3 years on, Rodrigo Borgia is now Pope Alexander VI, and his drive for constant copulation has lessened a little, so that now there are moments when that weight of hair encased in a fat silken neck is as much a pillow as a sex aid, as he buries his face, or nuzzles, yes, nuzzles, no other word will do for even so great a man, into it. What comfort she brings him. Sometimes after they have mated, he will put his head between her breasts and rests until his breathing moves into a heavy snore, while she lies caressing his ox shoulders with their sprinkling of coarse, dark hair. Only when she is sure he is deep asleep, she gently but firmly pushes him off, for she cannot breathe properly when his dead weight is upon her. It is an onerous business running Christendom, and though this aging man is famed for his wondrous stamina in the world at large, it is not always so when it comes to bed, and this too she has grown to understand. He still strives to give her pleasure in the way he uses his fingers to play with her, parting her pubic hair and slipping and hooking deep into the back of her, which to her surprise can make her breathless in a way she does not need to pretend. And how he smiles then, because for all his grandiose power, Alexander is a man who likes as well as loves women, and it is very important to him that they like him too.
It's not in the running order, but I feel like a cigarette. God, I'm glad the Catholic Church has changed. Now, no literary gathering would be complete without a Rupert, and we've got our own very special Rupert. Rupert Thomson, Thomson's Secrecy on Art, Suffering and Beauty. Fascinatingly, Rupert compares the creation of a novel to the art of sculpture. And when I read that initially, I thought that was just a very beautiful way to describe writing. But actually thinking on it further, it's quite a profound way to think about writing, because anyone that writes will tell you the first thing you're presented with is a blank screen upon which you must add things. The art of sculpture is the removal to show that which is contained within. So sharing his profundity, my very favourite Rupert, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Rupert Thomson.
When I lived in a South London council block in the early 80s, kids used to chant the name Rupert from the concrete balconies on my way home from work. I was, it was one of those names. Secrecy is set in Florence, and it's Florence in a dark time. The glories of the Renaissance are long gone. The Medici family is slowly dying out. brilliant, haunted wax sculptor arrives in the city, knowing nothing of the mystery and the intrigue and the passion that lie in wait for him. I'm just going to read from near the beginning. This is the wax sculptor talking. It ought to have been one of the most exciting moments of my life. There I was, high on a ridge, looking down on Florence for the first time. Late afternoon, April the 18th, 1691. A burnt orange sun dropped, trembling from behind a bank of cloud, like something being born. Gazing at the buildings clustered below me, the jutting crenellated towers veiled by the mist rising off the river, I felt a piece of paper crackle in my pocket, a letter of invitation from Cosimo III, and yet what? Even as my eye was caught by the tilt and swirl of birds above the rooftops, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Nothing there, of course. Nothing there. Only the quiet grass and the pines, austere and dense, and the mauve vault of the sky, soaring, vast. More than 15 years had passed, and still I couldn't forget what lay behind me, what followed in my tracks. I'd always feared there would come a time when, as in a dream, I would discover I was unable to run or even move, as though I were up to my waist in sand, and then it would be upon me, and all would be lost. I'd left my hometown of Syracuse in 1675, rumors snapping at my heels like a pack of dogs. I was only 19, but I knew there'd be no turning back. I rode through Catania and on along the coast, Etna looming in the western sky, Etna with its fertile slopes, its luscious fruits and flowers, its promise of destruction. From Messina, I sailed westwards. It was late July, and the night was stifling. A dull red moon, clouds edged in rust and copper. Though the air was motionless, the sea heaved and strained as if struggling to free itself, and there were moments when I thought the boat was going down. That would have been the death of me, and there were those who would have rejoiced to hear the news. I was in Palermo for a year or two, then I boarded a ship again and travelled northeast to Naples. I hadn't done what they said I'd done, but there's a kind of truth in a well-told lie, and that truth can cling to you like the taste of raw garlic or the smell of smoke. People are always ready to believe the worst. Sometimes in the viscous, fumbling hours before dawn, as I was forced once again to leave my lodgings for fear of being discovered or denounced, such a bitterness would seize me that if I happened to pass a mirror, I would scarcely recognize myself. Other times, I'd laugh in the face of what pursued me. Let them twist the facts, assassinate my character. Let them rake their muck. I would carve a path for myself, something elaborate and glorious, beyond their wildest imaginings. I would count on no one, have no one count on me. I was in many places, but I had my work, and I believed that it would save me. All the same, I lived close to the surface of my skin, as men do in a war, and I carried a knife on me at all times, even though in most towns it was forbidden. And every now and then, I would go back over the past, touching cautious fingers to the damage. It was this frame of mind, always watchful, often sleepless, that I made my way, finally, to Florence. I gazed down on the city once again. Set among the palaces and tenements was the russet dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, like half a pomegranate lying face down on a cluttered dining table, its thick rind hollowed out, its jeweled fruit long gone. I could hear no cries, no bustle, but perhaps that shouldn't have surprised me. I thought of the land I'd travelled through, the farmhouses unpeopled, roofless, the highways and footpaths overgrown, the unpicked olives staring like blown pupils from their branches. Ghost country. Up on that ridge, I dropped to my knees, not in reverence or wonder, but because I wanted to contemplate the world I was about to enter, to give myself a few moments to prepare. Thank you.
How very beautiful. There is a truth in a well-told lie. An elegant man, an elegant writer. Got quite lost in that for a minute. That's the beauty of reading for you. Our next reader is reading from a World Book Night title, and I don't know if you've had a chance to peruse the list. I'm excited by how eclectic it is, how familiar some of it is, and how surprising some of it is. That's the great joy, I think, of this list this year, and I think every year so far. Tracy Chevalier, during rehearsals, somebody fondly referred to her as Trace, to which she said, "The only person that calls me Trace is her postman. I'm not her postman." So reading from A Girl with a Pearl Earring, please welcome Tracy Chevalier.
Good evening. I'm going to read the sexiest scene in this book, though I'm not sure I can compete with the Borgias. This is a story about a young woman who becomes a servant in the household of a very famous painter. They have a kind of meeting of the minds, and he decides to paint her. And I'm going to read this scene towards the end of the book where the painting's almost finished, but it needs a pearl earring added to it so that you can call it Girl with a Pearl Earring. And he's asked her to pierce her ear, which she's already done, and she's going to wear his wife's earrings. He reached around to the cupboard behind him, picked up an earring, and held it out to me. "I want you to put it in," I said. I had not thought I could ever be so bold, nor had he. He stepped up to my chair. My jaw tightened, but I managed to hold my head steady. He reached over and gently touched my earlobe. I gasped as if I had been holding my breath underwater. He rubbed the swollen lobe between his thumb and finger, then pulled it taut. With his other hand, he inserted the earring wire in the hole and pushed it through. A pain like fire jolted through me and brought tears to my eyes. He did not remove his hand. His fingers brushed against my neck and along my jaw. He traced the side of my face up to my cheek, then blotted the tears that spilled from my eyes with his thumb. He ran his thumb over my lower lip. I licked it and tasted salt. I closed my eyes then, and he removed his fingers. When I opened them again, he had gone back to his easel and taken up his palette. I sat in my chair and gazed at him over my shoulder. My ear was burning, the weight of the pearl pulling at the lobe. I could not think of anything but his fingers on my neck, his thumb on my lips. He was looking at me, but did not begin to paint. I wondered what he was thinking. Finally, he reached behind him again. "You must wear the other one as well," he declared, picking up the second earring and holding it out to me. "Why? Can't be seen in the painting." "You must wear both," he insisted. "It is a farce to wear only one." "But I only pierced one ear." "Then you must tend to it." I reached over and took the earring. I did it for him. I got out my needle and clove oil and pierced my other ear. I did not cry or faint or make a sound. Then I sat all morning, and he painted the earring he could see, and I felt stinging like fire in my other ear, the pearl he could not see. Thank you.
I know for a fact I wasn't the only one that flinched when mention of needle and clove oil was made. It's fascinating, it's tiny details. For me, it didn't dry her eyes, he blotted them. Beautiful detail. Now, one's not meant to have favourites, and I don't, but the next reader is a very dear book to me. It's a secret scripture. It's a World Book Night title. You don't need me to tell you what the book's about. There are some books on this list I've read once, some I've read twice. This book I've read 4 times. I was on the panel for the Booker this year, the year this made the shortlist. So I read it once for the long list, once for the short list, once again, and then once just for me. If you read one book in your life, this wouldn't be a bad one to be the one book. It's a thing of beauty. And a very special writer of some very special books. It does give me huge pleasure and a massive privilege. And somebody, please text my mum. Please welcome Sebastian Barry.
Well, I wonder what the book is about now that he says that. Roseanne is nearly 100. She's in a mental institution in Ireland. But this is a memory she has when she was a little girl with her father in Sligo, where he was the grave digger. And indeed, the memory takes place in the graveyard, because in the graveyard there's one of those old round towers. And you'll see why they're there. Those were the days just after the First War. And maybe in those ditches of history, as it were, minds turned to strangenesses, quirks of education such as he was bent on that day with me. Otherwise, I cannot explain why a grown man would take his child to the top of an old tower with a bag of hammers and feathers. All of Sligo, river, churches, houses, radiated out from the foot of the tower, or so it seemed from the little window at the top. A passing bird might have seen 2 excited faces trying to peer out at the same time, myself heaping my weight onto my toes and bumping the underside of his chin. Roseanne, dearest, I shaved already this morning, and you won't shave me anyhow at the top of your golden head. For 'twas true I had soft hair like gold. Papa, I said, for the love of all things, drop the hammers and feathers and let's see what's what. Oh, he said, I am weary from the climb. Let's just scope our eyes over Sligo before we attempt our experiment. He had waited and chosen a windless day for his work. He wished to prove to me the ancient premise that all things fall at the same rate in the realm of theory. All things fall at the same rate, he had said, in the realm of theory, and I will prove it to you. I will prove it to myself. So now our 2 faces were jostling for position, framed by the ancient frame of the monk's little look-see window. At length it was clear that his experiment was impossible with both of us there. One or other of us would miss the outcome. So he sent me back down on my own by the dank stairway of stones, and I can still feel that wet wall under my hand, and the strange fright that grew in me to be separated from him, my little breast beating as if there was an uncomfortable pigeon trapped there. I came out from the tower and stood away from the base as he had bid me, for fear of the hammers falling and killing me dead. The tower looked enormous from there. It seemed to stretch up to the filthy grey clouds of that day, to heaven. Not a breeze stirred. I peered up faithfully, lovingly. It is no crime to love your father. It is no crime to feel no criticism of him, and especially so when I knew him into my early womanhood, or nearly, when a child tends to grow disappointed in our parents. It is no crime to feel your heart beating up to him, or as much of him as I could see. His arm now stuck out the little window, and the bag held suspended in the Irish air. Now he was calling to me, and I could barely catch his words. But after a few repeats, I think I heard him say, "Are you stood back, dearest?" "I am stood back, Papa," I called. I nearly screamed. Such a distance the words had to rise, and such a small window to enter to reach his ears. Then I will loose the bag. Watch, watch, he called. Yes, Papa, I am watching. He loosened the top of the bag as best he could with the fingers of one hand and shook the contents free. I had seen him place them there. It was a handful of feathers from the feather bolster on their bed, plucked out against the screeches of his wife, and 2 mason's hammers he kept for when he repaired the little walls and headstones of graves. I stared and stared. Or maybe I heard a curious music, the chattering of the jackdaws and the old scratchy talking of the rooks in the great beech trees there mingled like a music in my head. My neck was straining and I was bursting to see the outcome of that elegant experiment, an outcome my father had said might stand to me in my life as the basis of a proper philosophy. Although there was not a breath of wind, the feathers immediately drifted away, dispersing like a little explosion, even rising greyly against the grey clouds, almost impossible to see. The feathers drifted away. My father was calling in enormous excitement in the tower. What do you see? What do you see? What did I see? What did I know? It is sometimes, I think, the strain of ridiculousness in a person, a ridiculousness born maybe of desperation, that pierces you through with love for that person. It is all love, that not knowing, that not seeing. I am standing there eternally, straining to see, a crick in the back of my neck, peering and straining, if for no other reason than for love of him. The feathers are drifting away, drifting, swirling away. My father is calling and calling. My heart is beating back to him. The hammers are falling still. Thank you.
I feel a 5th reading coming on. Now, I don't know if you know, but World Book Night celebrates poetry as well as prose. So with each of the books, there's a poetic suggestion included. And our next reader is a poet, a performer, an author, and a broadcaster. He's been involved with World Book Night since 2011. I've known him for half my life. Lemn Sissay has put the boo in boom, he put the ha in happy, and he put the love in lovely. Ladies and gentlemen, Lemn Sissay.
This poem's called Invisible Kisses. I feel like I'm in the chic, Sikh boutique. This poem's called Invisible Kisses. If there was ever one whom, when you are sleeping, who would wipe your tears when in dreams you are weeping, who would offer you time when others demand, whose love lay more infinite than grains of sand, if there was ever one to whom you could cry, who would gather each tear and blow it dry, who would offer help on the mountains of time, and who would stop to let each sunset soothe your shades of mind. If there was ever one to whom, when you run, who will push back the clouds so that you're bathed in sun, who would open arms if you would fall, who would show you everything if you lost it all. If there was ever one who, when you achieve, was there before the dream and even then believed, who would clear the air when it's full of loss, count love before cost, If there was ever one whom, when you are cold, will summon warm air for your heart to hold, who would make peace in pouring pain, make laughter fall in falling rain. If there was ever one who can offer you this and more, who in keyless rooms can see open doors, who in open doors can see harvests yield, who in open doors can see open fields, and in open fields see harvests yield, then see only my face in the reflection of these tides through the clear water beyond the river's side. All I can send is love, and all that this is, a poem and a necklace of invisible kisses. Final poem I'd like to read for you is called Let There Be Peace. That's free, by the way. You can get that online. It's called Invisible Kisses. It's the only free poem that I give. Otherwise, I charge extortionate fees, and nobody buys them. Most novelists, many novelists begin as poets, but yeah. Let there be peace. Let there be peace. So storms can go out to sea to be. Let there be peace. Let there be peace. So frowns fly away like albatross, and skeletons foxtrot from cupboards. So war correspondents become travel show presenters, and magpies bring back lost property. Children, engagement rings, broken things. Let there be peace. So storms can go out to sea to be angry and return to me calm. So the broken can rise and dance in the hospitals. Let the aged Ethiopian man in the grey block of flats peer through his window and see Addis before him, so his thrilled, outstretched arms become frames for his dreams. Let there be peace, and let tears evaporate to form clouds, cleanse themselves and fall into reservoirs of drinking water, and let harsh memories burst into fireworks that melt in the dark pupils of a child's eyes and disappear like shoals of darting silver fish. And let the waves reach the shore with a final poem I'd like to read for you is a very quick one. Hardeep asked me to read this one, so I'm going to read it. It's called Sarcasm. I wrote it in an argument in a relationship, stood outside my flat in my Batman boxer shorts. I didn't stop in the middle of the argument and say, I could write a poem about that. I didn't do that. This poem's called Sarcasm. It doesn't work on the page. Sarcasm, she said, is the lowest form of wit. I said, it's not, is it? Thank you. That was for you.
I'm still crying from the first one. Half my life and he still makes me cry. Thanks, Lem. Now, if Josephine Hart were here, sadly she's not, I think she would have improved very much of what we've just heard and watched. The Josephine Hart Foundation has chosen the poems featured in each World Book Night title. Josephine was the wife of Morris Archie, and she died in 2011, and the foundation has been set up in her honour. She believed passionately that poetry should be heard and read, not just read. Poetry wasn't for libraries. And I think, as we've seen, poetry lives and poetry breathes. She was quite an incredible woman. I wanted just to tell you this about her. This is a quote from her. And if you forget anything else quoted tonight, remember this, because this will be your passport to passion. I was a word child in a country of word children, where life was language before it was anything else. That's Josephine Hart. Now, we've got a very special reader reading the first 3 chapters from Josephine Hart's novel, Damage. He's an actor, he's a screenwriter, he's a director. Everyone knows him. The last time I saw Charles dance, he was reading a shopping list over the courgettes in Waitrose, because this is now how the child of the immigrant rolls. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the very handsome and the mellifluous Mr. Charles Dance.
There is an internal landscape, a geography of the soul. We search for its outlines all our lives. Those who are lucky enough to find it ease like water over a stone onto its fluid contours and are home. Some find it in the place of their birth. Others may leave a seaside town, parched, and find themselves refreshed in the desert. There are those born in rolling countryside who are really only at ease in the intense and busy loneliness of the city. For some, the search is for the imprint of another, a child or a mother, a grandfather or a brother, a lover, a husband, a wife, or a foe. We may go through our lives happy or unhappy, successful or unfulfilled, loved or unloved, without ever standing cold with the shock of recognition, without ever feeling the agony as the twisted iron in our soul unlocks itself and we slip at last into place. I have been at the bedsides of the dying, who looked puzzled at their family's grief as they left a world in which they had never felt at home. I have seen men weep more at the death of their brother, whose being had once locked into theirs, than at the death of their child. I have watched brides become mothers, who only once, long ago, were radiant on their uncle's knee. And in my own life, I have traveled far, acquiring loved and unfamiliar companions, a wife, a son, and a daughter. I have lived with them, a loving alien in surroundings of unsatisfying beauty. An efficient dissembler, I gently and silently smoothed the rough edges of my being. I hid the awkwardness and pain with which I inclined towards my chosen outline, and tried to be what those I loved expected me to be: a good husband, a good father, and a good son. Had I died at 50, I would have been a doctor and an established politician, though not a household name, one who'd made a contribution and was much loved by his sorrowing wife, Ingrid, and by his children, Martin and Sally. My funeral would have been well attended by those who had gone farther in life than I, and who therefore honored my memory by their presence, and by those who believed they had loved the private man, and by their tears gave testimony to his existence. It would have been the funeral of an above-average man, more generously endowed with the world's blessings than most. A man who, at the comparatively early age of 50, had ended his journey. A journey which would certainly have led to some greater honour and achievement had it continued. But I did not die in my 50th year. There are few who know me now who do not regard that as a tragedy. They say that childhood forms us, that those early influences are the key to everything. Is the peace of the soul so easily won? Simply the inevitable result of a happy childhood? And what makes childhood happy? Parental harmony? Good health? Security? Might not a happy childhood be the worst possible preparation for life? Like leading a lamb to the slaughter. My childhood, adolescence, and young manhood were dominated by my father. Will, the total power of will, was his fundamental credo. Will, man's greatest asset, underused by the majority. The solution to all life's problems. How often had I heard those words? The combination of his unquestioning belief in his own power to dictate his life and the tall, heavy body in which this will resided made him a most formidable man. His name was Tom. To this day, years after his death, I associate strength of character with every Tom I meet. From the small grocery business his father left him, he built a chain of retail shops that made him a wealthy man. But he would have been successful at whatever career he pursued. He would have applied his will to the pursuit of his goal and inevitably have achieved it. He applied his will to his business, to his wife, and to his son. His first goal with my mother had been to win her, then to ensure that any way of life she pursued did not interfere with the other goals of his life. He wooed her with total dedication and married her within 6 months of meeting her. The nature of the attraction between them is still a mystery to me. My mother does not seem to have been a beauty. I heard her once described as having been a vivacious young woman. Or perhaps that's what attracted him. However, there is no trace of vivacity in my recollection of her gentle presence. She painted as a young girl. Some of her watercolors decorated the walls of my childhood home, but she stopped suddenly. I've never learned why. The nature of the bond between them, for it was undoubtedly there, still eludes me. I was an only child, and after my birth, they slept in separate rooms. Perhaps my birth had caused a trauma. Whatever the reason, there was my father's room and my mother's room, and they were separate. How did that young man live his sexual life? I've heard no scandalous stories, overheard no innuendos. Perhaps the purpose of separate rooms was not to banish sexual activity, but to curtail it for reasons of contraception. My life as a child and as a young boy seemed shrouded in a mist, permeated by the constant power of my father's presence. Make up your mind about it, then do it, my father would say. About exams, running, my only athletic prowess, even the piano lessons which I took, much to his embarrassment. Make up your mind, then do it. But what of uncertainty or pleasant failure? What of the will of others subjected to his own? Perhaps it was something he never thought of, not through callousness or cruelty, but because he truly believed he knew best, and that everyone's best interest would be served by following his. So, you made up your mind to be a doctor, my father said. when in 18 I decided to study medicine. Yes, good, stick with it. It's a tough course. Can you stick with it? Yes. I never wanted you to come in with me. I've always said, just make up your mind what you want to do, then do it. Yes. Even as I went my own way, I felt I served some purpose of his. So it is with powerful personalities. As we swim and dive away from them, we still feel the water is theirs. Why, that's wonderful, my mother said. You're sure it's what you want? Yes. Neither of them asked me why. If they had, I could not have answered. It was a vague feeling that just grew. If it had been thwarted, perhaps I would have found clear-cut reasons and been passionate in my commitment. Perhaps that sort of passion only comes when the will is thwarted. At 18, I went to Cambridge and started my medical studies. And though I studied the myriad ills of the body and ways to soothe them, this brought me no closer to my fellow man. I seemed not to care about him or love him any more than if I'd studied economics. There was something missing in me and in my commitment. Still, I qualified and decided to become a GP. Why not specialize, my father said. Become a consultant. No. Can't see you as a GP. Oh? Oh, well, I see you've made up your mind. I joined a practice in St. John's Wood. I bought a flat, and my life began to take shape. Free will had brought me there, not parental pressure, not terrible academic struggle. I had made up my mind. I had done it. The next step was obvious. Ingrid is a living beauty, my father said. Strength of character, too. There's great willpower in that girl, he continued approvingly. Made up your mind to marry then, huh? Yes. Good, good. Marriage is good. He paused for the soul. All my ambitions were fulfilled. All had been my own choice. It was a blessed life. It was a good life. But whose life?
I love the idea of parents never asking why. As a parent now, I've realized it's not that we don't think to ask why, we're just not that sure we want to hear the answer. As Damage showed, love is a universal theme in literature, I imagine, since, well, before people wrote anything down, stories were about love. And our next reader, Jojo Moyes, is a World Book Night title, Me Before You. Again, a story about love. Love between friends that migrates into the love between lovers. A well-loved book by many people. Ladies and gentlemen, Jojo Moyes.
Me Before You is a book about a small-town girl called Lou Clark who goes to work for a quadriplegic man, Will Traynor, and discovers quite early on in her contract that he's lost the will to live. And she decides to change his mind and give him something to live for. And she does this by taking him on a series of adventures. In this extract, he has persuaded her to try something new for a change. He's persuaded her to go to a concert, her first classical concert. With ordinary people, what Camilla Traynor would probably call working class people, I had observed a few basic routines as far as Will was concerned. Most would stare. A few might smile sympathetically, express sympathy, or ask me in a kind of stage whisper what had happened. I was often tempted to respond, unfortunate falling out with MI6, just to see their reaction, but I never did. Here's the thing about middle-class people. They pretend not to look, but they do. They were too polite to actually stare. Instead, they did this weird thing of catching sight of Will in their field of vision and then determinedly not looking at him until he'd gone past, at which point their gaze would flicker towards his wheelchair even while they remained in conversation with someone else. They wouldn't talk about him, though, because that would be rude. As we moved through the foyer of the Symphony Hall, where clusters of smart people stood with handbags and programs in one hand, gins and tonics in the other, I saw this response pass in a gentle ripple which followed us to the stalls. I don't know if Will noticed it. Sometimes I thought the only way he could deal with it was pretend he could see none of it. We sat down, the only two people at the front in the centre block of seats. He stared ahead, his head dipped into his shoulders as if he were trying to become invisible. "This isn't going to work," a little voice said. "Do you need anything?" I whispered. "No." He shook his head. And then he swallowed. "Actually, yes. Something's digging into my collar." I leant over and ran my finger around the inside of it. A nylon tag had been left inside. I pulled at it, hoping to snap it, but it proved stubbornly resistant. "New shirt. Is it really troubling you?" "No, I just thought I'd bring it up for fun." "Do we have any scissors in the bag?" "I don't know, Clark. Believe it or not, I rarely pack it myself." There were no scissors. I glanced behind me where the audience were still settling themselves into their seats, murmuring and scanning their programs. If Will couldn't relax and focus on the music, the outing would be wasted. I couldn't afford a second disaster. "Look, don't move," I said. "What?" Before he could finish, I leant across, gently peeled his collar from the side of his neck, placed my mouth against it, and took the offending tag between my front teeth. It took me a few seconds to bite through it, and I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the scent of clean mail, the feel of his skin against mine, the incongruity of what I was doing. And then finally, I felt it give. I pulled back my head and opened my eyes, triumphant with the freed tag between my front teeth. "Got it," I said, pulling the tag from my teeth and flicking it across the seats. Will stared at me. "What?" I swiveled in my chair to catch those audience members who suddenly seemed to find their programs absolutely fascinating. Then I turned back to Will. "Oh, come on. It's not as if they've never seen a girl nibbling a bloke's collar before." I had briefly silenced him. Will blinked a couple of times, made as if to shake his head. I noticed with amusement that his neck had coloured a deep red. I straightened my skirt. "Anyway," I said, "I think we should both just be grateful that it wasn't in your trousers." And then, before he could respond, the orchestra walked out in their dinner jackets and cocktail dresses, and the audience hushed. I felt a flutter of excitement despite myself. I placed my hands together on my lap, sat up in my seat. They began to tune up, and suddenly the auditorium was filled with a single sound, the most alive, three-dimensional thing I had ever heard. It made the hairs on my skin stand up, my breath catch in my throat. Will looked sideways at me, his face still carrying the mirth of the last few moments. "Okay," his expression said, "we're going to enjoy this." The conductor stepped up, tapped twice on the rostrum, and a great hush descended. I felt the stillness, the auditorium alive, expectant. Then he brought down his baton, and suddenly everything was pure sound. I felt the music like a physical thing. It didn't just sit in my ears, it flowed through me, around me. It made my skin prickle and my palms dampen. Will hadn't described any of it like this. I thought I might be bored. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. And it made my imagination do unexpected things. As I sat there, I found myself thinking of things I hadn't thought of for years, old emotions washing over me, new thoughts and ideas being pulled from me as if my perception itself were being stretched out of shape. It was almost too much, but I didn't want it to stop. I wanted to sit there forever. I stole a look at Will. He was rapt, suddenly unself-conscious. I turned away, unexpectedly afraid to look at him. I was afraid of what he might be feeling, the depth of his loss, the extent of his fears. Will Trainor's life had been so far beyond the experiences of mine. Who was I to tell him how he should want to live it? We waited until the auditorium was empty, then I wheeled him out, down to the car park in the lift, and loaded Will up without incident. I didn't say much. My head was still ringing with the music, and I didn't want it to fade. We pulled up outside the annex. In front of us, just visible above the wall, the castle sat, floodlit under the full moon, gazing serenely down from its position on top of the hill. "So," he said, "you're not a classical music person." I looked into the rearview mirror. Will was smiling. I didn't enjoy that in the slightest. Yeah, I could tell. I grinned at him. I really loved it. I said, I'm not sure I'd like all classical music, but I thought that was amazing. I rubbed my nose. Thank you. Thank you for taking me. We sat in silence, gazing at the castle. Normally, at night, it was bathed in a kind of orange glow from the lights dotted around the fortress wall. But tonight, under a full moon, it seemed flooded in an ethereal blue. We sat for a moment longer, listening to the engine tick its way to silence. Right, I said, unfastening my belt. We'd better get you in. The evening routine awaits. Just a minute, Clark. I turned in my seat. Will's face was in shadow and I couldn't quite make it out. Just hold on, just for a minute. Are you all right? I found my gaze dropping towards his chair, afraid some part of him was pinched or trapped, that I'd got something wrong. I'm fine. I could see his pale collar, his dark suit jacket a contrast against it. I don't want to go in just yet. I just want to sit and not have to think about... He swallowed. Even in the half dark, it seemed effortful. I just want to be a man who has been to a concert with a girl in a red dress, just for a few minutes more. I released the door handle. Sure. I closed my eyes and lay my head against the headrest, and we sat there together for a while longer, two people lost in remembered music, half hidden in the shadow of a castle on a moonlit hill. Thank you.
Yet another example of why it's so important to read. Thank you, Jojo. That was beautiful. Now, I don't know if you know, but World Book Night 2011 had Mark Haddon's Curious Incident and David Nicholls' One Day, both of which have been compared to our next reader, our next book. The Rosie Project by Graeme Simsion is a bit of a phenomenon, really. It's only published 3 days ago, and it's already gone top 10 in the bestseller list, and it's been published in 36 countries already. Graeme very kindly was on his way to Rome from Milan and has decided to do it via London, which I think is something, well, if you fly Alitalia, happens more often than you might imagine. Originally from Australia, a lovely man, a great pleasure to welcome with the Rosie Project, Mr. Graeme Simsion, ladies and gentlemen.
Greetings. I stood inside the entrance of a suburban house that reminded me of my parents' brick veneer residence in Shepparton. I had resolved never to attend another singles party, but the questionnaire allowed me to avoid the agony of unstructured social interaction with strangers. As the female guests arrived, I gave each a questionnaire to complete at their convenience and return to me, either at the party or by mail. The host initially invited me to join the crowd in the living room, while I explained my strategy, and she left me alone. After 2 hours, a woman of about 35, estimated body mass index 21, returned from the living room holding 2 glasses of sparkling wine. In her other hand was a questionnaire. She passed me a glass. I thought you might be thirsty, she said, in an attractive French accent. I was not thirsty, but was pleased to be offered alcohol. I had decided that I would not give up drinking unless I found a non-drinking partner. And, after some self-analysis, I had concluded that C, moderately, was an acceptable answer to the drinking question. Thank you, I said. I hoped she would give me her questionnaire and that it might, improbably, signal the end of my quest. She was extremely attractive, and a gesture with the wine indicated a high level of consideration, not exhibited by any of the other guests or the host. You are a researcher, am I right? She tapped the questionnaire. Correct. Me also, she said. There are not many academics here tonight. Although it is dangerous to draw conclusions based on manner and conversation topics, my assessment of the guests was consistent with this observation. I'm Fabienne, she said, and extended her free hand, which I shook, careful to apply the recommended level of firmness. This is terrible wine, no? I agreed. It was a carbonated sweet wine, acceptable only because of its alcohol content. You think we should go to a wine bar and get something better? She asked. I shook my head. The poor wine quality was annoying, but not critical. Fabienne took a deep breath. Listen, I have drunk 2 glasses of wine, I have not had sex for 6 weeks, and I would rather wait 6 more than try anyone else here. Now, can I buy you a drink? It was a very kind offer, but it was still early in the evening. I said, more guests are expected. You may find someone suitable if you wait. Fabienne gave me her questionnaire and said, I presume you will be notifying the winners in due course. I told her that I would. When she had gone, I quickly checked her responses. Predictably, she failed in a number of dimensions. It was disappointing. My final non-internet option was speed dating. The venue was a function room in a hotel. At my insistence, the convener disclosed the actual start time, and I waited in the bar to avoid aimless interaction until then. When I returned, I took the last remaining seat at a long table opposite a person labelled Francis, age approximately 50, body mass index approximately 28, not conventionally attractive. The convener rang a bell and my 3 minutes with Francis commenced. I pulled out my questionnaire and scribbled a name on it. There was no time for subtlety under these circumstances. I've sequenced the questions for maximum speed of elimination, I explained. I believe I can eliminate most women in less than 40 seconds. Then you can choose the topic of discussion for the remaining time. But then it won't matter, said Francis. I'll have been eliminated. Only as a potential partner. We may still be able to have an interesting discussion. But I'll have been eliminated. I nodded. Do you smoke? Occasionally, she said. I put the questionnaire away.
That was Graeme Simsion, Body Mass Index 23. Now, on the list is Casino Royale, an Ian Fleming book. Ian Fleming, well, there seems so much to say about Ian Fleming. I have a personal link with Ian Fleming in that he's from Dundee, and were it not for Dundee, I wouldn't be Scottish. A full explanation of that is on the website. It's not really. It's not that interesting. But I can't imagine anyone who's grown up in this country or indeed around the world that hasn't got some link with James Bond. I remember when I was a teenager being in a hospital for a couple of months, and there almost being physical fights between patients over the Ian Fleming books in the hospital. So desired were they. We're very fortunate tonight to be joined by his niece, Lucy Fleming, who's closely involved in Ian Fleming publications, and they've commissioned a new James Bond book by the amazing William Boyd, which is due to be published in the spring or the fall, for those of you watching the stream in Notting Hill. So please welcome, reading from How to Write a Thriller by Ian Fleming, Lucy Fleming, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello. I feel a terrible fraud. Among all these wonderful writers, I haven't written anything. But I am related to people who have, and tonight from Uncle Ian, I'm going to read an extract from an article he wrote in the early 60s. This is an extract, not the full article. There is only one recipe for a bestseller, and it's a very simple one. You have to get the reader to turn the page. Nothing must be allowed to interfere with this essential dynamic of the thriller. You cannot linger too long over descriptive passages. There must be no complications in names, relationships, journeys, or geographical settings. The reader must never have to ask himself, where am I? Who is this person? What the hell are they all doing? Your prose must be simple and unmannered. By all means, set the scene or enumerate the heroine's measurements as lovingly as you wish. But in doing so, each word must tell and interest or titillate the reader before the action hurries on. Having achieved a workmanlike style and the all-essential pace of narrative, what are we to put in the book? What are the ingredients of a thriller. Briefly, the ingredients are anything that will thrill any of the human senses. Absolutely anything. In this department, my contribution to the art of thriller writing has been to attempt the total stimulation of the reader all the way through, even to his taste buds. For instance, I've never understood why people in books have to eat such sketchy and indifferent meals. This may seem a small thing to worry about, but in fact it is a part of all successful writing, which consists of writing interesting words rather than dull ones. It is surely more stimulating to the reader's senses if, instead of writing, "He made a hurried meal off the plat du jour, excellent cottage pie and vegetables followed by homemade trifle," you write, "Being instinctively mistrustful of all plat du jour, he ordered 4 fried eggs, cooked on both sides, hot buttered toast and a large cup of black coffee." No difference in price here, but the following points should be noted. Firstly, we all prefer breakfast foods to the sort of food one usually gets at luncheon and dinner. Secondly, this is an independent character who knows what he wants and gets it. Thirdly, 4 fried eggs has the sound of a real man's meal, and in our imagination, a large cup of black coffee sits well on our taste buds after the rich, buttery sound of the fried eggs and the hot buttered toast. Personally, I'm not a gourmet. My own favourite food is scrambled eggs. In the original typescript of Live and Let Die, James Bond consumed scrambled eggs so often that a perceptive proofreader suggested that this rigid pattern of life must be becoming a security risk for Bond. If he was being followed, his pursuer would only have to go into restaurants and say, "Was there a man in here eating scrambled eggs?" to know whether he was on the right track or not. I think you will find that the sun is always shining in my books, a state of affairs which minutely lifts the spirit of the English reader. That most of the settings of my books take the reader to exciting places round the world. This pleases him and takes him out of his dull surroundings into a warmer, more colourful, more luxurious world. We then come to the final and supreme hurdle in the writing of a thriller. You must know thrilling things before you can write about them. My plots are fantastic, while being often based upon truth. They go wildly beyond the probable, but not, I think, beyond the possible. There are 3 strong incidents in my first book, Casino Royale, which carry it along, and they're all based on fact. I extracted them from my wartime memories of naval intelligence, dolled them up, attached a hero, a villain, and a heroine, and there was the book. The first was the attempt on Bond's life outside the Hotel Splendide. Far-fetched, you might say. In fact, this was the very method used in the Russian attempt on von Papen's life in Ankara in the middle of the war. The gambling scene grew in my mind from the following incident. I and the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Godfrey, in plain clothes, were flying to Washington in 1941 for secret talks with the American Office of Naval Intelligence before America came into the war. Our seaplane touched down at Lisbon for an overnight stop, and our intelligence people there told us how it was crawling with German secret agents. The chief of these and his 2 assistants gambled every night in the casino at the neighbouring Estoril. I suggested to the DNI that he and I should have a look at these people. There were the 3 men, playing at the high chemin de fer table. The feverish idea came to me that I would sit down and gamble against these men and defeat them, thereby reducing the funds of the German Secret Service. It was a foolhardy plan. I had £50 in travel money. I was cleaned out. A humiliating experience which added to the sinews of war of the German Secret Service and reduced me sharply in my chief's estimation. Finally, the torture scene. What I described in Casino Royale was a greatly watered-down version of a French-Moroccan torture known as passé à la mandoline. Don't look it up, which was practiced on several of our agents during the war. The next essential is to keep strictly to a routine, and I mean strictly. I write for about 3 hours in the morning, and I do another hour's work between 6 and 7 in the evening. At the end of this, I reward myself by numbering the pages and putting them away in a spring-back folder. The whole of this 4 hours of daily work is devoted to writing narrative. I never correct anything, and I never look back at what I've written. If you once look back, you're lost. How could you have written this drivel? How could you have used terrible 6 times on one page, and so forth? If you interrupt the writing of fast narrative with too much introspection and self-criticism, you will be lucky if you write 500 words a day, and you will be disgusted with them into the bargain. By following my formula, you write 2,000 words a day, and you aren't disgusted with them until the book is finished. Then the book gets published, and you start getting letters from people saying that the Orient Express has vacuum and not hydraulic brakes, and that you have mousseline sauce and not béarnaise with asparagus. But what, after all these labours, are the rewards of writing, and in my case, of writing thrillers? Above all, being a comparatively successful writer is a good life. You don't have to work at it all the time, and you carry your office around in your head. And you are far more aware of the world around you. Writing makes you more alive to your surroundings. And since the main ingredient of living, though you might not think so to look at most human beings, is to be alive, this is quite a worthwhile byproduct of writing, even if you only write thrillers.
Thank you, Lucy. Only a Dundonian would regard a treat being numbering the pages. Do look up Calvinism in your own time. Now, for the last 12 or 13 years, while I've been waiting for Radio 4 to give me midweek to present, yeah, I'll put it out there. I write pub quizzes, and I just wanted to quiz you briefly this evening with one question. Feel free to shout out. Who was the first person to play James Bond? Bob Holness. Bloody anorak in row 3. Well done. Played it on the wireless. So when you ask for a pee, please, Bob, it could have been a very different outcome back in the day. Our next reader is reading from Casino Royale, which is one of the World Book Night titles. An excellent book. And if you haven't read Fleming, I heartily commend you to do so. Absolutely cracking thrillers. David Nicholls had a book on the World Book Night list in 2011, and One Day is the sort of book people walk around carrying and evangelically ask people, the few people who haven't read it, to read it again. He's also unofficially known as the Duke of Queen's Park. Ladies and gentlemen, David Nicholls.
Hello. There's a terrible day in every young man's life when he realizes that he'll never get to play James Bond. And tonight is the nearest I'll ever get. I have a license to read. I thought long and hard about whether I should say that, and I wish I hadn't now, but there we are. It's out there. As an adolescent boy, of course, I watched the films, and I loved the films until one very specific moment, which is the moment in Moonraker, where Roger Moore's gondola turns into a hovercraft and a pigeon does a double take. And I remember then slightly falling out of love with the films, but thankfully there are the books. And the books are terrific, very different from the Bond, you know, from the movies. They're very lean and hard and strange and funny and cruel, and written in this deceptively simple prose, clear prose. And I was going to read from the prolonged torture scene with the carpet beater in the bottomless chair, but out of context, it seems a little strange, that scene. So instead, I'm going to read something that Lucy was talking about, which is the great first meal between Bond and Vesper Lynd. As they deciphered the maze, watch out for the very wise remark that James Bond makes about toast coming up. As they deciphered the maze of purple ink which covered the double folio menu, Bond beckoned to the sommelier. He turned to his companion. "Have you decided?" "I'd like a glass of vodka," she said simply, and went back to her study of the menu. "A small carafe of vodka, very cold," ordered Bond. He said to her abruptly, "I can't drink the health of your new frock without knowing your Christian name." "Vesper," she said. "Vesper Lynd." Bond gave her a look of inquiry. "It's rather a bore always having to explain, but I was born in the evening, on a very stormy evening, according to my parents. Apparently they wanted to remember it." She smiled. "Some people like it, others don't. I'm just used to it." "I think it's a fine name," said Bond. An idea struck him. "Can I borrow it?" He explained about the special martini he had invented in his search for a name for it. "The Vesper," he said. "It sounds perfect, and it's very appropriate to the violet hour when my cocktail will now be drunk all over the world. Can I have it?" "So long as I can try one first," she promised. "It sounds a drink to be proud of." "We'll have one together when this is all finished," said Bond, "win or lose. And now, have you decided what you would like to have for dinner? Please, be expensive, or you'll let down that beautiful frock." "I'd made 2 choices," she laughed, "and either would have been delicious, but behaving like a millionaire occasionally is a wonderful treat, and if you're sure, well, I'd like to start with the caviar, and then have a plain grilled rognon de veau with pomme soufflé, and then I'd like to have a fraise de bois with lots of cream. Is it very shameless to be so certain and so expensive?" She smiled at him inquiringly. "It's a virtue, and anyway, it's only a good, plain, wholesome meal." He turned to the maitre d'hotel. "And bring plenty of toast." "The trouble always is," he explained to Vesper, "not how to get enough caviar, but how to get enough toast. Now," he turned back to the menu, "I myself will accompany Mademoiselle with the caviar, but then I would like a very small tornadoes underdone with sauce béarnaise and a coeur d'artichaut. While Mademoiselle is enjoying the strawberries, I will have half an avocado pear with a little French dressing. Do you approve?" The maitre d'hotel bowed. You may have noticed I'm not a natural French speaker, by the way. "My compliments, Mademoiselle and Monsieur. Monsieur Georges," he turned to the sommelier and repeated the 2 dinners for his benefit. "Parfait," said the sommelier, proffering the leather-bound wine list. "If you agree," said Bond, "I would prefer to drink champagne with you tonight. It is a cheerful wine, and it suits the occasion, I hope." "Yes, I would like champagne," she said. With his finger on the page, Bond turned to the sommelier. "The Tattinger 45? "A fine wine, monsieur," said the sommelier. "But if monsieur will permit," he pointed with his pencil, "the Blanc de Blanc Brut 1943 of the same mark is without equal." Bond smiled. "So be it," he said. "That is not a well-known brand," Bond explained to his companion, "but it is probably the finest champagne in the world." He grinned suddenly at the touch of pretension in his remark. "You must forgive me," he said. "I take a ridiculous pleasure in what I eat and drink. It comes partly from being a bachelor, but mostly from a habit of taking a lot of trouble over details. It's very pernickety and old-maidish, really, but then when I'm working, I generally have to eat my meals alone, and it makes them more interesting when one takes trouble." Vesper smiled at him. "I like it," she said. "I like doing everything fully, getting the most out of everything one does. I think that is the way to live." Thank you very much.
Everyone knows you have tornadoes not with sauce béarnaise, but with au poivre. What was Fleming thinking? And now, to finish the evening, I imagine when you're writing the running order for an evening as august as this, and it's only April, it's difficult to find a way of rounding it off. I can think of no better than to call back Sebastian Barry, who's going to be reading, well, who else but Byron? So we'll go no more a roving. Ladies and gentlemen, for the second and loveliest time, lovelier, forgive me, I'm not Shakespeare, Sebastian Barry.
Well, I think I could risk saying that this is for
you all for being so lovely to us. And it's very short. Actually, I thought Yeats wrote this. So this is a forged Yeats poem by Lord Byron. So we'll go no more a-roving, so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving, and the moon be still as bright. For the sword outwears its sheath, and the soul wears out the breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, and love itself have rest. Though the night was made for loving, and the day returns too soon, yet we'll go no more a-roving by the light of the moon. Thank you.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. 500,000 books given out today. Quite a tremendous achievement. But let World Book Night not be about one single night. Let World Book Night be World Book Year. Be evangelical about your books. Be evangelical about your reading. People may fight wars over bridges, over mountains, and over rivers. I wouldn't mind a war over books. Have a lovely year, and hopefully see you next year. Thank you very much, everyone that's organised this. To Jude Kelly, and to everyone on the World Book Night, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.